people should buy less Costa coffees and go on less holidays and not go out for dinner so often, and then they'll be able to pay their electricity bill.
What advice would you have for renters who are maybe struggling to pay their rent at the moment?
It's very difficult for them because, I mean, it's not that the rents are going up so much. They have gone up a bit, but residentially, but they haven't really gone up commercially. But many of them are struggling to pay, and they've got to just take all the bits that they can get from local authorities, from wherever they can find it. But, you know, at the end of the day, if you want to stay in your house, you've got to pay the rent.
At the moment, of course, people are struggling. And as a landlord, you need to be responsible, but the tenant needs to come to you early and say, look, I've got a problem. Most landlords will help if they know soon enough. The problem is a lot of tenants bury their head in the sand, don't come and see you for 6-8 weeks, avoid you. That isn't the answer. The answer is to come before the rent's due and say, look, I'm going to struggle to pay all the rent, I can pay this, and this is what I'm going to do to try and pay the rest.
Speak to your landlord, because we're often in the same boat. We're struggling to pay a mortgage, they're struggling to pay their rent. So just keep it open and honest communication between the landlord and the tenant.
Maybe a side hustle, or what is your passion? Maybe you're doing something that you're passionate about right now. How can you develop that into kind of monetizing what it is that you love?
Yeah, I don't think there's any great simple answer. Government's got to get itself sorted out, and it doesn't help with interest rates, because if people have got problems paying their mortgages and they have to sell up, that's just going to put massive further pressure on the rental market. A lot of landlords seem to be pulling out of the rental market. I think what I call casual landlords, who are they've got one property, they've invested in it because it happens to fall that way. A lot of those seem to be pulling out of the market, so that's definitely going to put more pressure on the market.
People need to realise there could be a couple of tricky years coming, cut their expenses, don't be too frivolous, and just, if you're in that position renting at the sort of lower end of the market, might buy a room or a small studio, you're going to be only able to cut costs, or get more money and get a different job, improve your way of life. So they're the two things you've got to deal with. There's not much else you can do.
I got told off by my stepdaughter for saying the other day on a YouTube channel that people should buy less Costa coffees and go on less holidays and not go out for dinner so often, and then they'll be able to pay their electricity bill, which, I said it tongue-in-cheek a little bit, but to be fair, that is probably partly true. I mean, the ones who are really struggling aren't doing any of those things, and I do accept that. But I mean, there's a lot of people out there who, in the old days, people would save money. Now it's very hard to save money. It's not fashionable to save money. So that no one has that cushion anymore, do they?
No.
And I think that's partly the problem.
That's bad. It's bad financial education. I think part of the problem is that, we're still not taught how to manage our money and what mortgages are and credit cards are in schools as much as we should. There are business modules, but unless you do those, you come out of school and even university largely in the dark.
Talk to the landlord. I think for landlords, having a good tenant there is more important than maximising rent. So if you are struggling, talk to the landlord, see if there's somewhere to meet in the middle. Remember, the landlords also have their own struggles because they're paying more in mortgage interest and so on. So I understand why a lot of landlords might be pushing up rents. It's not necessarily just opportunistic, it's because they also have to. Landlords' margins have been reduced over the last, 10 years, dramatically. It's causing a lot of landlords to leave the industry, which you don't want. You actually do want landlords to provide rental housing. The thing that landlords like more than anything is actually just having good tenants. And if the tenant's having a problem, talk to the landlord and see if there's something that can be worked out.
So do you think a lot of landlords, if they were asked at the moment, because I know people who are renting, they've had their rent put up by, let's say, £400 a month, and if the tenant was to say, I can't afford that, any more than what we're currently paying, do you think most landlords would be receptive to that sort of thing?
See, a lot of it depends on when the landlord bought the property and therefore what their personal financial situation is as well. Landlords that have bought a long time ago are probably still sitting in a reasonably comfortable position with respect to the mortgage because they're not mortgaged to the hilt. If they are mortgaged to the hilt, then they've got bigger problems because they need that income to actually pay the mortgage. So it really, really does vary on the landlord themselves. This is part of the reason why, a lot of the landlords that have probably come into the market in the last 10 years are finding all these struggles because they bought properties at a time when interest rates were very low, and now they're struggling as interest rates are moving up. This is also part of the reason why I think renting is moving into more of a professional space, because really what you don't want is lots of individual landlords. What you want is larger institutional and corporate landlords who are not going to haggle over the small things. If there's maintenance issues, they'll just get it done, because they're not going to be penny pinching. They're looking at the bigger picture. Smaller individual landlords, on the other hand, do run into these issues, especially right now with the cost of living crisis. So in answer to your question, if there is an issue and they talk to the landlord, and if they're a good tenant, then really the landlord will try and find a way to make it work.
I think this universal credit is a big problem because, it just makes sense to pay it direct to the landlord. And years ago, that's what happened. And there was much less arrears and problems because it got paid direct. Now, the law is they've got to want to do that. The tenant has to ask to be paid direct.
Which is kind of ridiculous.
Which is crazy when you think about it.
Talk to your landlord. Communication is absolutely vital. The worst thing from a landlord's point of view, if you don't know what's going on and they're not communicating, you start thinking the worst. And obviously the tenant may be embarrassed because they can't afford to pay the rent. It's all about communication.
Well, firstly, I mean, there's mental health issues, people, really, really struggling. The first thing is that these markets are cyclical. There is a way out of it, and to be positive, that things will change. So that's the positive side. The negative side is there's quite a lot of things you can do to counter a lot of these, increased costs. Go around, just obvious things, go around switching the lights off and things. I've had to do it,
I think this universal credit is a big problem because, it just makes sense to pay it direct to the landlord. And years ago, that's what happened. And there was much less arrears and problems because it got paid direct. Now, the law is they've got to want to do that. The tenant has to ask to be paid direct.
Which is kind of ridiculous.
Which is crazy when you think about it.
That would make tenant, they won't do that.
Absolutely. That would make so much difference, and it will stop people ending up on the streets.
I think a certain degree of negotiating with the landlord, but you've got to be aware that landlords going through a potentially even bigger pinch with mortgages, and the cost of maintaining properties has gone through the roof. I'm here because my business is quirking.com, and we provide energy systems to landlords so they don't have to pay for solar systems to go into properties, and the tenants that they have get those solar systems, they get the electricity from those solar systems at a lower cost than they get from the grid. So I guess it would be tell your landlord to get in touch with quirking.com. Sorry for the cheeky plug.